All right, thank you so much, Gina. She's quite an asset to domestic violence services. Hi, all. My name is Larkey, as Gina announced, and today we are talking about the myths and facts of domestic violence, a look into what's real and what's not. Um, with the facts section, there are quite a few statistics. I will be concentrating a lot on the myths since there are seem to be so many myths still out there that people operate in. I feel like it's important to really zone in on the myths um, portion of this presentation. So next slide. So the first myth is domestic violence only happens to poor women and women of color. When the fact is that domestic violence does not discriminate against age. Everybody under all socioeconomic statuses and backgrounds of all colors suffer and are victims of DV. I just said this. Domestic violence happens in all kinds of families, relationships, persons of class, culture, religion, sexual orientation, marital status, age, and gender can be victims or perpetrators of domestic violence. Because women with money usually have more access to resources. Poor women tend to utilize community agencies and are therefore more visible. So women with a little bit more money and have access to that money tend to be able to not have their situations more known. They can hide them a little bit better, which is sometimes their preference. Next. Here we go. So one of the big ones is alcohol, drug abuse, stress, and mental illness cause domestic violence. So this will actually be one of my specialties within my field. We're working on here at DVS is substance use. These alcohol and drug abuse do not cause these things. They don't cause domestic violence. They go along with domestic violence, but they do not cause the violence. Abusers often use these as excuses to explain their violence. Does drug use and all of those things exacerbate it? Yes, it does, very much so, but it's not the cause. It generally happens when an abuser has learned and chooses to abuse. But alcohol use does exacerbate it. It's rarely caused by mental illness, but is often used as an excuse for domestic violence. I have had some occurrences working on the hotline where some callers will call in and have been in long-term relationships for many years. And some kind of mental break has happened with their partner, and then they become physically violent. So it is rare. It does occur, but it's super, super rare when there's some kind of serious mental health breakdown or issue that may cause domestic violence to be exacerbated. But it's really is super rare because domestic violence is a learned behavior. So just to make that sure. Next slide. So this one is kind of a big one. Violence is about anger and rage, and the abuser is out of control. That is a huge myth. A lot of times you'll hear things like, oh, well, he just needs anger management and everything will be okay. And it's really important to point out that DV is a learned behavior, and they are very much in control. There are many reasons it is obvious that an abuser is in control of his actions. He does not batter other individuals. He waits until there are no witnesses and abuses the person he says he loves. The abuser often escalates from pushing and shoving to hitting in places where bruises and marks will not show. If he were out of control or in a rage, he would not be able to direct or limit where he kicks or punches or lands. That tends to happen when They have had contact with law enforcement or have suffered some repercussions as a result of their violence. And so then they become a little bit more or a lot more crafty at how they implement the violence. And so that points to somebody who is in extreme control. So that's one of the things I just want to point out. That's a big myth. Next slide. Thank you, Gina. Batterers are violent in all of their relationships. So, yeah, as the previous slide said, that they're not batterers to other people or not perpetrating domestic violence onto other family members, say maybe aunts or uncles. They choose to be violent to their partner and hurt them in ways that would never hurt someone else. The violence is about control over the person. That's what domestic violence is about. It's about control. Violent behavior is a choice. Perpetrators use it to control their victims. Domestic violence is about using their control, not losing their control. Their actions are very, very deliberate. That kind of comes along in the lines of where we talk about the serious narcissistic abuse, where you have covert and overt abusers. And the overt abusers are the ones that are very open with the abuse. They may do it out in public. They don't care who sees. The covert abusers are very, very much harder to spot because they are the pillars of society. They could be doctors, lawyers, police officers, but behind closed doors, they are a completely different person with their partner, and the abuse comes in. Thank you, Gina. I think there was a slide that we need to go back to that I didn't go over. Can we go back to that, the slide before? Yes. Batterers are violent in all of their relationships. So I kind of did this to kind of blend into each other, and they're not violent in all their relationships. They are violent with their family or the partner. When it's intimate partner violence, the partner they have chosen, as well as with the children. They choose to be violent and hurt them in ways they wouldn't hurt somebody else. Yeah, so I think we went over that. I feel like there's a slide that missed, but that's okay, because I can just keep talking. Are we on the facts sex portion, or?
That seems to be what the next slide is.
Okay, so can we pause there for just 1 minute? Does anybody have any questions or comments about the myths section, or are we saving comments to the end, Gina?
It's up to you.
Okay, so yeah, do we have any questions or comments about the myths portion of the slide?
Larkey, this is Rosemary.
Hi.
I'm just working with a client, and this is my first experience. And I'm trying to, she thinks that it's because her husband drinks that he's hitting her.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very glad to see that I can point that out as a myth. It seemed like a myth, but how long does it take you to influence victims so that they understand it's not the alcohol and it's not anger management?
Rosemary, sometimes that's a very good question, and I come across that a lot in dealing with clients. And first and foremost, I will tell you, she has to be ready to receive the information and hear it, because sometimes, you know, your walls are up, and you want them to be better, you want them to get better, you want the violence to stop. However, what I tell people, it's because she may think that way. Please try to understand that she may think that way because they may drink and it gets worse. And when he doesn't drink, the abuse is still present. It just may not be present in a way that she's not recognizing, right? So when it comes to domestic violence, like learning those universal red flags and how they implement their red flags, and the emotional and psychological abuse is huge. And for everybody, one of the myths that I forgot to put in there, I just wanted to assume that everybody would know, is that domestic violence is more than hitting. And so sometimes keep in mind when you're might be dealing with a client that is experiencing intimate partner violence, that is one of the huge myths, is that, well, he's not hitting me, so how is it domestic violence? And with the abuse, with when substance use is present in the relationship, one of the big things I point out is that he would still be abusive if he were not using. Because addiction is a medical condition and intimate partner violence is a learned behavior. That is the biggest, I think, portion and thing that you can use to maybe bust through some of the myths or false beliefs that they may have about that. And that's the one point I would try to drive home, is that substance use is a medical condition, whereas intimate partner violence is a learned behavior. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and it answers another question. I'm sure that his father was doing this to his mother, so that explains something for me. I do have a question about police, but I can wait till the next section.
Okay.
And if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll be sure to keep track of those for Larkey.
So if we don't have any more, we can go to the next slide, and I can always come back to a question if you guys have one, and we've moved on to the next set of slides. So this is the core definition, which we'll probably go over throughout the entirety of the workshop, is that domestic or dating violence is a pattern of controlling behaviors that one partner has or uses to get power over the other, including physical violence or the threat of violence to get control, emotional, mental, or sexual abuse, and also financial abuse is a huge one. 85% of domestic violence victims are women. That's a huge percentage, a really huge percentage. So this one I thought very interesting. I wanted to put in some facts that weren't commonly known. And domestic violence is most likely to take place between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. are peak hours for domestic violence to take place. One half of all homeless women and children in the U.S. are fleeing from domestic violence. That is an astronomical number. It's astronomical. Every 9 seconds in the U.S., a woman is assaulted or beaten. Every 9 seconds. As many as 324,000 women each year experience intimate partner violence during pregnancy. Children who experience trauma, including witnessing incidents of DV, are at greater risk of having serious adult health problems, including tobacco use, substance use, obesity, cancer, heart disease, depression, and a higher risk of unintended pregnancy. And physical abuse during childhood increases the risk of future victimization of women and the risk of future perpetuation of abuse by men more than twofold. So I just want to stop right there for a second. That's where it kind of not solidifies, but it reinforces the fact that DV is a learned behavior. I tend to tell clients and just people that I talk to in general when I'm talking about domestic violence, our children don't do what we say, they do what we do. So when they see this dynamic in a relationship, of course, they grow up thinking this is what a relationship looks like. And it is a very hard behavior. It can be unlearned, but it's very hard to unlearn. Before we move on, does anybody have any questions or comments on the last two slides? Or do you need to go back at all?
I noticed that there's not a lot of information on emotional abuse for facts.
So one of the reasons why I didn't concentrate a whole lot on the emotional abuse, or because there was a lot I wanted to put in, but I was so my time constraint was a factor. I only had a few minutes because I can talk about DV all day because that's what I do. Emotional, and this is something else for Rosemary as well, going back to part of your statement and question, is that emotional and psychological as well as financial abuse is much, much harder for women to get away from. Statistically, women that are experiencing physical intimate partner violence leave much sooner than women or anyone who is experiencing domestic violence that has no physicalities involved, because of the myth that it is just physical. It's not emotional and psychological. And so, and with a lot of domestic violence organizations, the concentration, unfortunately, you know, like for admittance into shelter is a certain level of imminent danger, which almost always includes physical violence. Because of course, I would love to be able to take someone in that's undergone 20 years of emotional and psychological abuse. In a nutshell, that takes a toll on a woman, on a person, way, in the long run, way more than the physical violence. It crushes the spirit and the soul.
And I just wanted to add on to that we do have a workshop coming up about healthy relationships and kind of addresses that emotional abuse more in depth. But we're full right now for that workshop, but we will be sending out recordings to everyone who's registered so far. So don't worry about missing out. There's a question about what would you recommend for a child to do if they are victims or have witnessed abuse? What kind of resources are available to them?
That's a really, really good question. And depending on the type of abuse, like here in Snohomish County, of course, we have Dawson's Place that helps children. There are some resources out there. Here's the issue. Yes, I do too, Angela. Here's the issue: when they're children and they're underage children, the parents have to initiate whatever resources they want to try to get from the community. And so the parent has to be in a space where they're willing and able and in a mindset to get help and healing for their children, so they have to get to that point. There are some resources out there, like for here at us at Domestic Violence Services, we have children's advocates within our shelter. We are equipped with 2 children's advocates, and they solely concentrate on the children. And we have some resources that we hook them up with schools. We go out and educate the schools on how to help kids. So things are getting a little bit better, but ultimately when you want to get help and resources for the kids, the parents have to initiate it, because normally the children are under 18. The children are, under the age of 18. So, and I also want to point out to you guys that as prevalent as this as DV is, there is not enough counseling out there. Like, it is extremely difficult to find counselors that specialize in just domestic violence. I don't know why. That's a big issue. I get tons of requests for outside advocacy, people who just want to speak to somebody maybe once a week, and we're not equipped yet to do that here at Domestic Violence Services. So I know I went a little lengthy with that, but I hope that answers your question. So we can go on to the next slides, Gina. So I wanted to put some things in there about LGBTQ communities, because that is another part of intimate partner violence and domestic violence that is ignored and overlooked. And so I wanted to make sure that I put information in there about it. There's really some great information out there. 43.8% of lesbian women and 61.1% of bisexual women have experienced sexual assault, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner at some point, as opposed to 35% of heterosexual women. So that's a huge jump in percentages. 26% of gay men and 37.3% of bisexual men have experienced the same behaviors by a partner in their lifetime. In comparison, only 29% of heterosexual men. Now, these are reported statistics, so you know there are a lot of heterosexual men that may not report the instances of intimate partner violence due to social conditioning and machismo and other things of that nature. They just have too much shame and embarrassment around it. Transgender victims are more likely to experience intimate partner violence in public compared to those who do not identify as transgender. I thought that was a very interesting fact, which just kind of points to the hate that our nation likes to engage in. It's more shaming, it's more humiliating. Is there another one on there? Does DBS come across? Yeah. So there's a question in the chat. I think I will. Can you give me that question, Gina?
Oh yeah, so someone said, does DBS come across a family where each family member is exhibiting abusive behavior without recognizing their own behavior as abusive?
Absolutely, Bonnie, absolutely. So one thing I like to tell a lot of women as a survivor of DV as well myself is that it is a learned behavior, and for women a lot of times it starts out as a survival technique, right? And you can start to exhibit those behaviors because this is the dynamic in which you're living in. So you learn how to manipulate, you learn how to do all the things you need to do to survive within that situation at that time. And yeah, there are times that I've come across people that are, of course, perpetrators slash victims, especially for women, because it becomes a defense mechanism. And you start to be able to survive within that dynamic. It might get you assaulted less. And it starts out as a defense mechanism, and and you're not realizing that. And there are people who are in intimate partner relationships and they're both abusers. They're both abusive towards each other. That is more common than I think people think. Does that answer your question, Bonnie? Okay, next slide. So there we go. So LGBTQ Black women, we're having technical difficulty. I think it's the last slide, yeah. Black women that are LGBTQ are more likely to experience intimate partner physical violence compared to those who do not identify as Black or African American. LGBTQ white victims are more likely to experience sexual violence compared to those who do not identify as white. So I think those were two very interesting facts. And LGBTQ victims on public assistance are more likely to experience intimate partner violence compared to those who are not on public assistance. It kind of goes back to those slides and further back where, you know, if you have access to some more resources, then you can actually maybe avoid some of the shame and humiliation in accessing public assistance where there shouldn't be any. There is. So can you provide some state certified that are available? Kathy, there are some treatment providers, and Gina, if you could, I can put that in the chat. And most of them are definitely here. The thing is that with the DV treatment provider programs is almost always they're court ordered. There are only 2% of abusers will actually voluntarily say, oh my God, I have a problem and I need some help. Now, there's a very low percentage of abusers that actually voluntarily go get help. So there aren't a whole lot of treatment providers out there. There are 3, and we can definitely put them in the chat. I do know that, Gina, does Elizabeth still do the victims panel?
Yeah, that's kind of still on hold because of COVID right now,
Right.
but we did have those victim panels as well.
Right.
But we did have some groups that were more, not necessarily for abusers, but those are mainly just ongoing dose effect groups that were kind of support to prevent abusive behavior.
Right.
So if you're ever interested in that, feel free to email me. I'm the one that's sending all of you the emails. So that's where you can get more specifics on those. And I can email all of you with the, specifically you, Kathy, since you requested the information about the treatment providers as well.
Yeah, because I know that we only have about maybe 3 in this area. Because they don't get help. Does anybody have anything else in specific that I didn't cover that you have a question about or a comment about?
And before we answer some questions, would everyone be able to quickly fill out this poll before? I know a lot of you might be leaving at this time, but if any of you could take the time to fill out this poll so we can really improve what we can do better in future workshops and really get a gist of what your needs are, especially the question earlier about, you know, having an hour-long workshop. That's something that we really want to hear from you about your feedback about these workshops, so that we can provide more of these that are helpful to you specifically. And another thing is, if you're ever looking for workshops specifically at your, like if you work at an agency or your workplace where you feel like you need some domestic violence training, feel free to email me as well, because I'm part of the prevention education department. And so we offer education in that realm, especially in terms of healthy relationships and all of that information too. So go ahead and feel free to ask questions for Larkey about the information that she offered. And just wanted to say, this is really helpful information. I learned a lot. I always learn a lot about seeing the different myths and facts. And these ones, some of these ones even surprised me as well. A lot of them, even I've worked in this for so long, and I've been teaching myths and facts for so long, and some of these even surprised me too.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure I got some missing facts in there that weren't very, everybody knew those. I wanted to really dig in. So that's why it took me a minute to do that.
Well, one question I have, I don't know if it's the appropriate time to ask it, but I did a welfare call to the police on Friday. That was my first one ever. It took them quite a while to get there, so I'm not sure I would do that again. But then the very next day, a neighbor called, and it was between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. When the police called me back, they said they didn't have any record of any incidents there. The people have only lived in that apartment for a couple months. Now, will they have a record because it's been I called, then the neighbor called, and does that make any difference?
Well, the difference is did they come out? Did they give you were the police called? Did they come out and were they given a case number? Because that's where it's actually on record now. Is when they give you a card with a case number, whether they take them to jail or not.
Okay, I don't know whether they did the second time because I didn't call. They definitely didn't the first time. So,
but it's still important, Rosemary, to document that yourself, because it's, unfortunately, and Gina can attest to this, even though neither one of us work for the legal department, I have some legal experience as well as she does. It's not what you know, it's what you can prove. And that's what abusers like to do. And they will use the legal system and twist it and turn it around for their purposes to no ends. I can't tell you how many clients I have that have no contact orders or placed on them, or restraining orders or DVPOs, and they are the victim. So they create a victim defendant situation. So they are very good at manipulating the legal system to their benefit.
Is there do you recommend calling the police or not?
I think that depends. So that's where we would call safety planning coming into play. That's what we do a lot of. That's what I do a lot of on my when I'm working on the crisis line in the call center, is that because sometimes it's not safe to do so. Sometimes it can cause more damage, and it's really hard to ascertain when is a good time to call and when isn't. And particularly, it depends on what you know about the situation and how deep you are